Hello, global citizens, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Dominikos Chrysidis, Managing Editor of Catholicos.world, the community building project and online magazine of the Brussels-based Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability, folks. At Folks, we believe that we should not go back to business as usual after COVID-19. We want to engage for a better future, and this is why we have put together 10 elements, how we can improve governance, economy, and society. All these at the Engagement for Better petition that you can find online on change.org. After a first webinar introducing the petition that we did on the 13th of May, this is the second webinar for the petition. The first webinar specifically on one of the 10 specific elements of the petition. This is one is on basic income, and more of them are coming. On the Catholicos YouTube channel, you can find the recorded version of the previous one, and you will be able soon to find also this one if you want to go back and check some of the insightful findings and proposals that our... I have a problem with my... I think that... Can you hear me all? I think there was a problem with my microphone. I don't know why, but maybe it's just my headphones. So you can find also this version of our webinar on the YouTube as from the day after tomorrow. I'd like to thank everybody again that is with us, but specifically before I give the floor to Yoriko, I'd like to introduce you to Yoriko. Thank you, Yoriko, for accepting the invitation to be here with us and actually chair the session. Yoriko Yasukawa has worked for over 35 years in efforts to advance inclusive and sustainable development, human rights, and cultures of peace within and outside the UN system. She has held positions such as Regional Director of the UN Population Fund for Asia and the Pacific, the UNICEF representative in Mexico and Ecuador. She's currently a part-time lecturer at the Meiji Gakuin University in Yokohama. She also works as an independent journalist and consultant based in Costa Rica. Hello, Yoriko, from Brussels to Costa Rica. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominikos. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias from Costa Rica. As Dominikos mentioned, I worked for many, many years in the UN system, and much of our work had to do with trying to ensure that human right to a decent standard of living for everybody. And an important part of that, of course, is a decent income. So I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this forum, and especially to hear from experts who've not only studied the subject, but also have worked on trying to apply it in practical terms in real life situations. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to the panelists as well. Let me introduce them. The first speaker will be Leire Rincon Garcia. Leire is the chair of the Unconditional Basic Income Europe network. She is also a PhD candidate at the University of Barcelona and the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. And Leire will talk to us, well, to try to give us an overview of the Universal Basic Income topic, what it is, what it isn't, and also tell us a little bit about how the debate around the issue has evolved over the years. The second speaker will be Jorge Pinto. He is a research associate at the Center of Ethics, Politics and Society at the University of Minho in Portugal. Jorge is also the founder of the political party Libre in Portugal. Jorge will talk to us about how universal basic income might or might not contribute to the post-pandemic transition to a greener economy. And our last speaker is François Denuit. François is associate researcher at the European Studies Institute at the Free University of Brussels. He is also political advisor to a member of the European Parliament, Philippe Lamberts. François will speak about how universal basic income might be applied in Europe, and particularly as a pan-European initiative. So each of the speakers will speak for about 10 minutes. And after everybody is finished, we'll open the floor for questions. So Leire, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's a pleasure to be discussing the current events and basic income with all of you. So as you said, Yoriko will begin explaining a bit about what basic income is, what it's not, and also why there is renewed interest in this current moment, and then try to explain a bit about what the current reactions have been to the economic crisis that has sparked from the pandemic, and explain why the reactions or the policy options that are being implemented are quite far from universal basic income. So let's start with the definition. A universal basic income is a policy idea that has yet not been implemented anywhere, although there has been some experiences to try to test different aspects of the policy. But the key idea is that it would consist of a universal, unconditional, and individual-based cash payments made to all of the population, regardless of socioeconomic and working status. So no strings attached. And as I said, while there has been many efforts to try to understand how this policy would work, there hasn't been any testing of the pure version of the UBIE, and certainly no implementation. We have, or one of the closest experiences I think that we have in terms of unconditional cash transfers is the Alaska Permanent Dividend Fund, it consists of an individual unconditional and universal cash payment made to all of the Alaskan residents. But it's on a yearly basis. So it's slightly different from a basic income because it's not a regular payment. And it certainly does not enable, to maintain living standards. So why are we revived, or why is there a renewal of interest now with universal basic income? And why now, and why have we seen different peaks of attention over time in different situations? So it seems that basic income always gets much political, media, and public attention in times of crisis. And interestingly, those crises always share some commonalities, and specifically kind of something that all these crises have in common when basic income receives attention is that there's a threat to kind of the conventional form of income maintenance from the majority of the population, which is employment. So basic income always gets in the agenda when it seems that there's going to be a crisis of employment in some way or another. So, and that would not only endanger social well-being, but also the well-functioning of the economies and economic growth. And we saw this, for instance, with the last two peaks of attention towards basic income. And by this, I mean like very important and mainstream peaks of attention towards this policy idea. We saw this in the 60s and 70s, and we saw this a few years ago with the prospects of labor automation and prospects of structural unemployment derived from this labor automation. And so in those times, basic income received much attention. Much of the piloting started, or some new pilots started. It was also discussed in the European Parliament. It was a very mediatic topic in relation to labor automation. And it seemed, and the interest seemed to be springing about the fact that current welfare institutions, especially unemployment schemes, would not be sufficient to tackle the unemployment crisis. And although this crisis that we're facing currently is very different, I think it shares the concern of the previous one in the sense that the future of employment as a reliable source of income for the majority of the population is threatened. So once more, what we're facing is a real economic crisis. There is much uncertainty about how many jobs will be lost permanently, and about the consequences of this job loss and subsequent income loss from the part of the population towards the shape and the speed of the economic recovery after the pandemic. So in this sense, while the crisis is very different, it's completely a different nature. It shares, so the interest departs from the same kind of the same source or the same nucleus, right? So here I think that why many people, and especially many people that were not sympathizers of the idea of basic income before, so why there's this renewed interest and why they're defending the idea is because of the design of the potential design of the universal basic income, and how it could solve the current crisis and the economic crisis. So first, because basic income is a non-means tested policy, it could reduce the big administrative burden of current policies and get the cash out into people's pockets as quickly as possible, which given the current urgency is very needed and positively valued. Also, by being universal, it means that everyone receives it. So no part, absolutely no part of the population, or at least a very small part of the population, would be left out. But also it doesn't carry the stigma of conditional cash transfers. And this is very important, I think, and has been recognized as being a very important quality now, because after the severe lockdowns, the health crisis, and the derived psychological effects of all of this, the last thing that we probably need is to stigmatize our populations. And finally, it's also currently being advocated because it might be quite an efficient and a strong policy to have in a context of uncertainty like the one that we're facing now, when we don't really know how the health crisis is going to evolve, whether we're going to have future outbreaks, and whether we're going to need future lockdown periods. And having already some sort of universal cash transfer might act as a very efficient buffer to the uncertainty that we're facing, and certainly help solve or help make the economic crisis not last any longer than is needed. So despite the fact that in the current situation, I think that we're seeing renewed interest towards the idea, and especially renewed interest from many people that were not sympathizers and were probably very against this idea of universal basic income. Despite all of this, the sort of responses that we're seeing are still quite far from a UBI, and I don't know to what extent they're likely to move towards a UBI. So it's true that what many welfare states experts are saying is that crises are not always the best times for reform and for reforming our institutions. But while they might not be the best times for this, they're certainly the times where reform is needed. And actually, I think one of the lessons we learned from this is that when there's political will, resources, and a vast amount of resources, can be very quickly mobilized, and policy can be implemented. And we've seen that, I don't know, in 3 months, since March, we've seen around 200 countries implement just under 2,000 measures, and most of these measures have been some sort of cash transfers, in their large majority non-contributory cash transfers. So we've certainly seen that when there's political willingness and the economy is at stake, there is potential to mobilize and reform our systems. So certainly this would be the pertinent moment for reform. And what we've seen is that many of these cash transfers, they have been moving towards unconditionality. Many of them have been loosening up their conditions or making advance payment, increasing generosity. Some of them have switched the type of like moving from service or in kind towards cash transfers. So while we've seen small steps being made forward, I think the whole response is it's kind of reflective of the previous welfare state logic and the previous institutions that we had in place. And this is not only because the type of cash transfer design, so it's not only because the fact that these cash transfers are still targeted, conditional, and directed to population subgroups, but the whole approach reflects the same logic. And this is because rather than having one sort of effective universal cash payment made to all of the population, what we're seeing is different sort of schemes and patchwork of policies being targeted to different population subgroups, like the self-employed, like the unemployed, then furloughing, targeting cash transfers to children as well. So we're seeing the same sort of the same logic of expansion towards different sort of conditional and targeted schemes, rather than this sort of more homogeneous reform. And the issue with this, there are various issues. The first one is that this sort of response carries over the same sort of problems or inconveniences that we had before with welfare states. So we still have, we would still have the problem of non-take-up, so that is population subgroups, which in principle would be eligible to receive a sort of a cash transfer, do not receive it either because they do not apply for it or because the administration fails to detect the fact that they're eligible. We would also see poverty or unemployment traps and missing out on very, very important population and very vulnerable population subgroups, as well as stigmatizing the population and along, etc. So in this sense, although it's clear that, you know, welfare states are expanding, there's introduction of new policies and so on, we're seeing the same kind of logic and the same, the same patterns being repeated. And this is an issue not only because we're going to make, or it's likely that the economic crisis will last longer than it should with this sort of response, but it's also an issue because most, the vulnerable groups of the population will have more long-lasting consequences and the inequality will be exacerbated. But also because I think we should remember and kind of broaden up the approach of how we tackle this crisis, and remember that before this crisis, we had already other urgencies and other critical situations that we were facing. We already had the risk of labor automation, the prospects of structural unemployment, aging populations, even gender violence, which is also an economic issue, the climate emergency, which I guess we will discuss now, and also the fact that our welfare institutions were already in crisis and already needed a reform. So I think we should kind of take a broader outlook in the way we are going to tackle this crisis, bearing in mind that we had other crises and other problems to solve before this.
Thank you so much, Leire. And I think that was a great overview, especially for the not specialists on the issue. And what you said about countries repeating the old patterns of the welfare state really resonates with me here in Costa Rica, because they have a cash transfer program for people who have lost their jobs and so on, but it is a targeted program, and there are issues of people not being able to access it because they don't have access to the online request system and so on. So thank you. Jorge, please.
Hi, hello all. So thank you for the invitation. First of all, it's a pleasure to participate and to have the opportunity to debate with both Leire and François, whom I know very well and are very good experts on basic income. So I'll try to focus more on the ecological and environmental aspects of basic income, because it's not only my field of expertise, but it was as well my open and entry door to the basic income issue. When back in 2012, 2013, I started reading about the subject, I was always puzzled by the fact that the Greens were the main advocates in favor of a basic income. And whenever I was reading about it, I was never really finding direct green arguments, if you want, in favor of a basic income. And furthermore, I knew, and I still know, that in theory and in average, the more wealth you have, the more or the higher is your environmental impact, right? So I was always trying to figure out why giving money to the people would be a better thing for the environment. Well, and some years after, and with the 4 years of research on the topic, I think I have at least some clues to try to answer that. And it pretty much depends as well on the green approach that you are considering, right? We have at least two main green approaches, environmentalism on one side and ecologism on the other side. And they are, I wouldn't say opposed, but very different and distinct in some key issues. So very quickly, environmentalism is a managerial approach that wants to promote good environmental outcome within the economic infrastructure that we currently have. On the other hand, ecologism would require structural changes to the economic model and to the patterns of consumption and production. So this is the key difference, and basic income can be part of both an environmental strategy or an ecological strategy. What are the practical differences? Well, the first one is that in environmental approach, green growth is favored. So this means that basic income would be part of a green growth policy package that would say, okay, growth is needed, is actually even essential in order to have good environmental outcomes. I'm very skeptical about this, but we can get to that later. On the other hand, an ecological approach would say, well, maybe focusing on growth, blind growth is wrong in itself, so is a wrong starting point. So what we should be aiming at is at a post-growth economy, so a degrowth economy, and in that sense, a basic income would enter as a way to avoid that people that would be reducing their hours in the labor market or even abandoning the labor market would be left outside any economic safety. So you see here already that basic income can have two very different ways of supporting green strategies. So what about growth and production? Well, to be clear, there's environmentalists that, as I said, defend green growth. There's the eco-modernist manifesto that was published, I think, back in 2015, that advocates that growth is the only way to preserve the environment. The issue here is that the decoupling between what is economic growth and the environmental impacts is far from being a reality. And there's no really, how can I put this? There's not really a deadline or a date when this will become a reality. We keep on saying that technology will put us there. I certainly hope so, but it's difficult to be a reality in the near future at least. And what we see already is that we are facing the sixth or probably the sixth mass extinction. We have seen now in May that it was the warmest month of May ever recorded. So the reality is there to prove us that we really need to take measures now, and wait in a technological breakthrough in the future might be very risky, or to put all our hopes in that might be very risky. So what advocates of an ecological basic income and declaration of interest, I place myself among those. What we argue is that we need to consider seriously degrowth society, and basic income, far from being an ecological panacea, is a key element of this degrowth society. Of course, it is much more demanding than a green growth basic income. First of all, because its value, its amount needs to be higher to really empower the people to experiment different ways of living, more frugal ways of living, to experiment reducing the hours in the labor market and dedicate them to activities in the autonomous sphere where the environmental impact will be lower. But this requires as well a lot of parallel measures. A key one that I was just reading about a couple of minutes ago is linked to the gender gaps, for example, because even during the pandemic with people at home, we have seen that women were, of course, I say of course, because unfortunately is the case in most of the situations similar to this one, were the ones needing to do more care work, more housework, even if they have a full-time labor as the man. So a basic income, if it's not if it's not introduced in company with different and parallel measures, might have similar effects. And as parallel measures, I think immediately, and for me this is the essential one from an ecological perspective, is the legal reduction of the working hours, or labor hours if you want. I think that basic income from an ecological perspective makes only sense if you reduce legally, I repeat, the working hours. Why? Because this will, I would not say force, and that's why I'm a supporter of a basic income. I really do believe in the power of unconditionality. I think people will want to experiment different things. But the thing is that they will only experiment it if first they have a contact with that and they know more or less what is expecting. Second, if they have the economic safety to try it. And third, if they have the time to try it, because we might have all the advertisement campaigns, all the campaigns you want to ask people to have different behaviors, different attitudes, to try to live differently, to have different contributions, to participate more in the civic life of their communities. Well, if they don't have the time to do it, they simply cannot do it, right? So I think that, and now linking and bridging the ecological aspects to the COVID crisis, I think that time and the resources, in the case basic income, are essential to do this. Linking this to the COVID crisis, I'll recur to a cartoon that actually was shared by François some months ago, I think pretty much the beginning of the confinement, that I saw in his Facebook profile, and afterwards I even wrote a text based on that. So this cartoon basically showed a father at home cooking with a little kid, and commenting, well, actually staying at home is not that bad. And anyways, the job I was performing was of no purpose. So it served absolutely nothing, right? So, and I think this is really, it really made me think that this simple cartoon, because we keep on asking, we ecologists keep on asking for strong measures. We keep on asking governments to take measures to reduce the environmental impact and so on. And almost nothing is done, or very little is done. And out of a sudden, people themselves were asking for stuff that not even the most radical ecologists dare to ask. And we have seen, at least in Europe, aviation, for example, reduced by 90%. So this is something that no one even dared to imagine in the past. And this was asked by the people themselves. And I think that the key issue here is the fear element, right? So I think it's two key issues, is the fear and the lack of an alternative imaginary. So this is the conclusion I had from this cartoon. The fear from climate change, the fear from climate destruction and disruption, if you want. But people are afraid. People, at least in Europe, they know that climate change is real. They know it is happening. They know that it will have strong and catastrophic consequences. But even when they think it will be in the medium term, they think it will be in 20 years, in 30 years. So it's a fear which is very different from the fear of a pandemic or a virus that might kill you next week, right? So this fear completely makes us accept, for the good and for the bad, because we've seen with the technological tools of control that this might be problematic as well. But fear is a strong element to convince us of living differently and taking strong measures. And the lack of imaginary is pretty much what ecologists and degrowthers have not yet managed to convince people. So it's to show them that there is a world outside the productivist and consumerist way of living that we live in. And I think even us advocates of basic income sometimes have difficulty to pass this message, because we keep on thinking about the introduction of basic income as part of our current social and economic system, and the results of it more or less the same way, or keeping more or less the same way the existing social and economic system. And I think that the basic income, at least if I wouldn't say enough to live, but very close to that level at least, the potential of transformation is so strong that the imaginary that we need to have is of a radically different society. So it's something that I myself have difficulties to imagine. And this period of confinement, for bad reasons, obviously, has at least exposed us and made us challenging some of our certainties about our hours committed to labor, about the city and who the city serves, about staying at home with your kids and spending more time with them, about civic participation even. You see, I was amazed by the number of signs and messages at the balconies, at the windows. So people reclaiming the public space, this is something that it amazes me. I love it. And why were we not doing it before? Again, I always come back to the same two reasons: lack of time, lack of resources. So if both things go together, and if we can put both things together, I think that ecological, I think that the basic income can indeed promote an ecological society. And I conclude with this before the questions. To repeat myself, is not a panacea, certainly. I like to stress this when we are among advocates of basic income, because quite often we present basic income as a solution for all the problems in the world. It is not the case, but I think it is a very strong measure, probably even the strongest measure, if we want to move to a post-productivist society, which will of course be more sustainable in the social, economic, and ecological dimension. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jorge. It's really interesting to me that both you and Leire are reiterating the message that, you know, we shouldn't be looking at UBI as just another technical instrument to add to the arsenal of the traditional social policy system, but as a chance to really question basic assumptions like that economies have to grow, or that employment necessarily has to be the principal source of income. And definitely, I think this time where we're forced to rethink everything is a great time to debate this. So thank you. So François, your turn.
Hi, it is my turn first to start by thanking you for inviting me, and I'm also particularly happy to debate the issue with Jorge and Leire, whom I also think are great scholars and brilliant minds who know a lot about the subject. I'm going to talk about more specifically the idea of a pan-European basic income. So not a basic income implemented in each national member states of the European Union, but how the EU itself could be able to distribute a basic income to all citizens of the European Union. And let me start again with a small definition. As Leire said before, with the different characteristics of the basic income can be given to all members of a given society, to all members of a political community. And so we can define that political community at local, regional, national level, but we can also define it at the supranational level. And in my case, what I'm looking at is the idea of a pan-European basic income given on a monthly basis to all legal residents. So I'm not talking about nationality, but about legal residency within the borders of the EU, on an individual basis without conditions of resources or any work requirement. We are talking here also of a partial basic income, partial in the sense that it's not a full UBI as some call it, which means not a basic income sufficient on its own to ensure a decent standard of living. So the idea is not here to replace national welfare states with a supranational welfare states, but rather to have a multi-level social Europe. And I say multi-level because we could think of it as a two-level social Europe, but some welfare states are organized in a federal way. So some of the social benefits can be given at different layers of institutional structure. why should we look at the idea of a European basic income? We may argue that implementing the basic income at national level would be sufficient on its own if well implemented, if it's sufficient to live on, or if it's a partial one, if it goes well with the other policy measures implemented. But the EU itself has, through the process of integration, it has had a destructuring effect by creating the single market and then later on creating the monetary union. It has had an impact on the capacities of redistribution and the capacities of stabilization, as we call them, of national welfare states. So the destructuring of national structures has not been matched by an equivalent restructuring at the supranational level. And this has resulted in a certain number of tensions, which I can address a little bit more later. And so the idea here is also to let's say, restore or fill in the gap of the social deficit that has accompanied European integration. We also know that within the EU, you have many different kinds of philosophies of welfare state, many different kinds of welfare states, which are, depending on the model, giving greater place to the market, to the family, or to the state action in terms of their role for social security. And having a basic income, because it is unconditional, might be also a way, also because it is additional, complementary to what exists at national level, it might be a way to bypass some of the difficulties of harmonization. This being said, and I will stress that later on again, doesn't mean that we should avoid focusing further on convergence and harmonization or minimum standards, binding minimum standards at European level, but at least we can see how the unconditionality of that measure would, and on top of national systems of social security, would bypass the need to define how we say what are the resources we can take into account to provide the social benefit, what are the conditions we need to take into account to provide it with respect to work and so on. And it is also necessary because we know how the EU suffers from a bad image in terms of its lack of social policies. So just to clarify, we are talking of a social Europe that is multi-layered, meaning that the EU acts as a complementary welfare layer to what exists at a national level. And its idea is to offer some form of systemic support to member states and to individuals within the EU. So I would distinguish three main advantages, three main levels of action of the European UBI. The first one is individual, the second one is at the level of member states, and the third one is related to the EU level. So if we take the first one into account, imagine a modest UBI directly distributed by the European Union. We can imagine something between 200 and 300 euros on average, meaning that it would be different according to the standard of living in each country. We can, if we take into account what is called the purchasing power parity to distinguish the different cost of living within each country, we could think about 85 euros in Romania and about 270 euros in Denmark. This is the range where in which the average of 200 euros would fit on a European level. So it would offer another way for the EU to have a new anti-poverty measure, a new anti-poverty agenda. We know that the EU currently focuses a lot on the activation agenda, meaning that we need to reinforce conditionality, we need to focus on means testing to target people. But as Leire mentioned before, these have a lot of drawbacks. So having some form of unconditional transfer to all European residents would be a way for those who work to have a top-up on their wage. Again, this doesn't mean that we should not address the need for a minimum wage, a fair living wage. And for those who are on social benefit, it would also be a top-up with the aim to reach at least a decent standard of living, which is generally based on the poverty line, 60% of the national median income. And so for individuals, this would mean additional revenue in a form that is unconditional, and therefore, as Leire also mentioned, would reduce some of the impact on health, stress, and all these problems associated with uncertainty about the future. Of course, on its own, this is not enough to live on, but imagine in times of crisis like just now, we would be able to raise the amount, as we have seen with the current recovery packages that the EU has put forward, and that it might also put forward soon with a new plan. There is a possibility for the EU to raise a number of resources when it is needed, so we could easily also raise the level of the basic income in moments of particular need. So I want to stress that if we link this European basic income within an anti-poverty strategy at European level, this also means that we need other measures such as a binding minimum standard in terms of adequacy of social benefits. This is the first point. Then the second point is about the member state level. And here, what is important is to increase resilience of member states within the EU. And this focuses mostly on what we call macroeconomic stabilization. We know, and we have seen also in the last crisis that has resulted in the sovereign debt crisis in the EU, that member states needs some social benefits to respond to external economic shocks in order to maintain a decent standard of living for everyone, to maintain a certain level of consumption and get the economy flowing. But we also know that the countries within the monetary union may have different capacities to respond to these shocks, and that some countries may suffer a deeper problem, and then there's a risk of contagion to other member states. So having some form of fiscal capacity, some form of redistribution within the EU from member states, between member states, would also be a way to increase the capacity of the whole system to face economic shocks. In the case of the coronavirus pandemic, the shock is actually the same for everyone. So it's different from what we have seen during the economic and financial crisis and then the sovereign debt crisis, where the shock hits some countries harder than others. So here we have the same shock, but different capacities of response. So we would still need some form of redistribution, and we can see it with how Italy, for example, has been particularly hit. This is something that is important in order to function as a whole in the EU and avoid problems that lead to negative spirals with some countries at the mercy of financial markets, among other things. And we also know that if we want the EU to work well all together, and the monetary union in particular, we need to reduce social imbalances, meaning the different levels of unemployment, poverty, and so on, that are different in the different member states of the EU. So this is about also increasing social cohesion, increasing convergence, social and economic convergence between member states of the EU, and ensure redistribution across countries. Basic income of the sort I am talking about would at a macroeconomic level, certainly benefit more countries in the south and central and eastern countries of the EU. They would be what we call net beneficiaries, and other countries in the north mostly would be net contributors. But it is important to bear in mind that even if at member state level, some would be contributing and others would be benefiting, even in those countries who would be contributing more, individuals would benefit from the basic income. And so it is important to remember that even if Germany, for example, is contributing more, individuals within Germany would benefit from the scheme. And we know that there's a high level of poverty even in Germany, and a level of social benefits that is sometimes very much below the poverty line. And then the third level is the EU. Imagine if the EU is providing every resident tangible benefit on a monthly basis that would arrive directly on the bank account, increasing security for people. I think the EU would benefit from a much caring image than it currently has. And so this would also increase legitimacy for the EU. So it's a way also to transform the EU in a caring union and support the European project, because it would be seen as much more social than it is currently. I must mention that some of the advantages that I talked about, for example, the idea of having a basic income as a macroeconomic stabilizer, might not be the most optimal policy to do that. There are other ways to have macroeconomic stabilization in the EU, but the strength of the European basic income is its capacity to actually score well on these different issues altogether. So I must repeat what Jorge said, and I completely agree that the basic income is not the panacea, whether at national or at supranational level. It needs to be integrated in a number of, with other policies in a broader policy package. But it is also important to stress, and Jorge said it as well, that the emancipatory value, the transformational capacity of the basic income is much higher than many other policies, and much higher than the pure monetary value of the basic income. Now, it's one thing to say that the basic income might pursue different objectives and have a series of advantages. It's another to say how and whether it is possible to put it in place, actually. So in terms of feasibility, we can distinguish, I would say, three levels of feasibility. The first one is legal feasibility. And when I was doing my research on the basic income, many were saying, yeah, social security is not a competence of the EU, it's a national competence, so forget about it. But first, we are not, in this particular proposal, replacing national social security with European social security. We have a European top-up of national systems, whether you implement a basic income at national level or whether you keep it the way it is currently. And in this, and given this, it can be cast as a tool aiming at what is actually a competence of support of the EU, which is increasing social cohesion. So if you take that into account, there are actually legal avenues within existing European treaties to put it in place. And the recent response to the pandemic, among others, with this embryonic proposal of a European unemployment benefit scheme, has shown that it is possible, because the debate was the same about the legal competence of the EU, that it is possible for the EU to implement such kind of schemes. The recent call from Spain, Italy, and Portugal to implement a European-wide minimum income, so a conditional one, which is in the short term much needed as well, is also an example of the fact that when there's a will, there's a way. And of course, if we want to argue that it is not possible, and if someone can object that it is not possible from the perspective of existing treaties, there are the ways to go further within European integration, such as enhanced cooperation. So a number of 9 countries at least deciding to go further together in implementing new policies. You can have intergovernmental agreements, as we had with the mechanism, the stability mechanism during the last crisis. And ultimately, we can always resort to treaty change, which is never easy, but it is important to remind us that throughout the history of European integration, there has been many treaty changes, and we are now starting with a new conference on the future of Europe, so nothing is actually impossible. Then we need to talk about financial feasibility. And here there are, I would say, 3 main avenues. Either we redistribute what is currently within the existing funds within the EU budget towards that aim, but I do not think this is a viable solution. First, because we have not enough money to fund a basic income if we just use, for example, the European structural funds. And second, these funds are used for other important purposes. The second avenue is to increase the number of national contributions, or the amounts that member states are actually providing to the European budget. This is, of course, a possibility, and it would be a welcomed one if member states decide to do it that way. But we know how we are actually, even in these times of crisis, seeing member states very reluctant to provide, or at least some of them, to provide more financial resources to the budget. And we will see whether the next European Council in July will actually adopt the plan put forward by the European Commission, which actually proposes a lot more solidarity than currently exists, among others through the issuing of common bonds. And then the third possibility, and I think this is the most important one, is increasing what we call EU own resources. So the capacity of the EU to have more resources that are directly flowing into the European budget, rather than being national contributions. And these, it's important to raise the fact that these are related to European integration. So it makes sense to have them at European level, when currently we have mostly the VAT or tariffs, but you can think of environmental taxes, a corporate tax, which is not only important because it would raise additional revenue for redistribution within the EU, but it would also reduce some of the problems which are actually linked to the destructuring that I mentioned before and impacting the redistribution of national member states because of the regulatory competition between member states, because of fiscal dumping that multinationals can exert on national governments. And then you can think of Tobin tax, so the financial transaction tax. And if you put all these different resources together, you can reach different levels for the UBI. The main, let's say, the first proposal for a European basic income, which was called by its advocates, Philippe van Parijs and Yannick van der Borcht, Euro dividend, relies mostly on increasing the amount of the VAT, so consumption tax, indirect consumption tax, to the European budget, and then redistributing that to European citizens. It has the advantage of being already a Europeanized and vastly harmonized tax, but it is not a progressive or redistributive tax, as we know VAT is not. So it might not be the best, but it is a first step, and I am myself advocating to link the social and ecological approach and use what can be called a carbon dividend at European level with other sources of revenue, such as a corporate tax, as a source of funding of the Euro dividend or European basic income. And I will stop shortly, but the last aspect is what can be called the administrative feasibility. Who is in charge of providing this basic income to everyone? There you have basically two approaches. Whether the first one is you create an administrative agency, an EU agency, that would directly distribute that to individual bank accounts, or you provide each member state with a lump sum that is dedicated to the distribution of the basic income, and then national agencies have the responsibility to give it to their national citizens or residents. Both have advantages and disadvantages, but these are the two avenues we can think of to put it in place. And just to finish, we have now seen in the last months a lot of interest in the basic income debate again, with calls for an emergency UBI. There is a European Citizens Initiative that was recently accepted, validated by the European Commission, and the campaign will start in September. And I'm sure Leire, who's behind all this, will be able to talk about it later if you have questions. And there are also calls for pilots, not only in the EU, but also around the world. I think I'm not the biggest partisan of an emergency basic income, although it would clearly have beneficiary effects, but it risks also remaining a short-term measure. It depends on how it is funded and so on. But we have all this that can build a new momentum to also think about how a supranational basic income can feed into the debate. And with the need to have solidarity responses at the European level, and with the EU being, thanks to institutional structure, a laboratory for what can happen at on a global scale, I think we need to explore much more in depth the idea of having a pan-European basic income, and of course not neglecting at the same time all the other measures that Jorge mentioned about redistribution of reduction of working time, and I mentioned also having binding minimum standards and so on and so forth. We can go back to this later. Thank you, and sorry if I was a bit long.
I found what you said about social cohesion particularly relevant, because I think we've all seen under the pandemic how it's exacerbated these tribalist tendencies around, issues that you never would have expected would have created such divisions, and definitely ensuring a certain level of income hopefully would alleviate some of that too, and also to bring people back to seeing the benefits of integration and coming together rather than breaking up. So why don't we go to the questions? One of them is there a danger of a guaranteed basic income becoming a bone that the super rich could agree to give through the state or the EU to the masses of insecure, increasingly jobless or working poor populations? If seen this way, such basic income could contribute to the continuation of the huge inequalities that currently exist and which are getting worse. So would anybody like to tackle that? Raise your hands. François?
I'm sure we were all shy to raise our hands, but we all wanted to answer that question. But I will just shortly say that we also, of course, know that there are different versions of the basic income. And it's always important to keep in mind that some see the basic income as a way to scrap the welfare state altogether, provide just the means to survive and consume, and not necessarily tackle inequalities. So the main question is, how does it fit within existing social security? What does it replace? And mostly, how is it financed? If you want to have a basic income addressing both poverty and inequalities, you need to have a source of funding that is actually redistributive, that is basically making the rich pay for their own basic income and for parts of the basic income of others. And you need to link this also to, as Jorge said before, to ecological dimensions, and mostly to how we want a society to redistribute the cake, and not only think about how to make the cake grow. So we need to link the fiscal dimension, the financing of the basic income, with both tackling inequalities and ecological transition as objectives.
Thanks.
Could I just quickly add something?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, just to briefly comment. I think even the most progressive UBI funded sort of policy would not end. I mean, as Jorge said, and François was reiterating later, UBI is not a panacea. So even the most progressively funded UBI policy would not end with the problems of the huge wealth accumulation. I mean, we will need additional policies. We will need to combat fiscal evasion, increase progressive taxation, increase taxes to corporation, and so on. So it's true that it would not end wealth accumulation, although the empowering potential that this measure would have, if it's accompanied with a strengthening of the welfare state and if it's progressively funded, is quite evident. And I think precisely because of this potential, it generates so much backlash, and we're not seeing it implemented.
Thank you.
And if I may, just a quick note as well. We are most certainly very much aware of that risk and of that problem. And the irony here is that when you go to a conference, to whatever conference about basic income, you could barely find a person defending such an extreme liberal case for a basic income. But then in the public debate and in the political debate, this is the thing, at least people in the left immediately use as an argument, which is very good. So that's why I'm kind of in minority, I would say, amongst basic income advocates, because I'm extremely skeptical, and I replied this in one of the other questions in the forum here. I'm extremely skeptical about big UBI advocates coalitions, right? So a sort of catch them all pro-UBI front from extreme liberals to extreme left, because you have an extreme left defense of the basic income as well, minority, but it exists. So my point and my political aim, at least, is to build coalitions by convincing those, as François said correctly, on the social ecological side of the political spectrum of the positive impact of basic income, and by convincing them to build a progressive, ecologist, feminist front in favor of a basic income.
That with basic income, as in all other important issues, you do need to have a broader dialogue on what your purpose is and the kind of society that you would want to build, and what kind of minimum basic things that you can agree on in terms of, you know, what you want to build and how to get there. So thank you. We have another question. Have there been any good examples close to UBI around the world? And I was also going to ask, related to that, I understand that you know, Alaska, with this universally distributing the oil revenues, is something akin to UBI. But so that's another question. Who would like to take that one? Leire, maybe?
Yes. What was the question again? So,
examples of close to UBI around the world, and I had asked specifically about the experience in Alaska.
Yeah, I would say this one is one of the closest ones, and I like to use it because it has two key characteristics. So although it's far from a UBI in various ways, it has two important characteristics. The first one is that it's unconditional. So I mean, I think the only condition you have to fulfill is being a legal resident for more than 6 months or 1 year in Alaska, and that's about it. And therefore, it's universal, so everyone gets this this cash transfer. Also, minors get a smaller part, So it's the clearest example of an unconditional and universal cash transfer. The issue is that it's an annual basis, so it's not that regular payment, and it's not sufficient to live with, and also the quantity is susceptible to the revenues from the oil funds. So those would be the differences in relation to UBI. But I think it's a good example precisely because of the universality and unconditionality.
Thank you.
I don't know if François and Jorge have other examples.
Yeah, François was raising his hand.
Yes, there has been no real UBI institutionally implemented at national level in the world. But we can talk about all these experiments that have happened. And I'm not going to go into much detail, but what is interesting is to see how the debate has evolved. If you look at the experiments and what they aimed to look at in the 70s in North America, you could see that the main objective was to see whether a universal and unconditional payment would actually reduce the work, the labor of people. And when you look at the Finnish experiment, the aim was mostly to see whether now it would actually incentivize people to work more, or to take up a job, or to start a new firm as entrepreneur. So the shift in how we have perceived the basic income is already interesting. But then there's I think some keys that we need to take into account when we think of the experiments, and I want to stress that because a lot of people are always talking about how much we need pilots and how much we need different kind of experiments. And although I think they have some form of utility to increase data, the level of the amount of data we have, and to stimulate public debate, we need to stress that experiments have a number of pitfalls, because they always, at least those who have been implemented, mostly focus on people who are already on social welfare. So they're not really integrating, in terms of the beneficiaries, all the people in society. They're not taking into account net contributors, because it's always an amount of money that is arriving from elsewhere, externally, and then that funds the project. But we are not seeing the basic income within a scheme of redistribution, so we cannot really imagine what its social effect can be, except for example, the experiment in Dauphin, Manitoba, where the whole city was taken into account. It's what we call a saturated site, and where we could see the beneficial effects in terms of health and education. But the experiments also have a number of other problems, because they are limited in time. So you cannot necessarily know whether people are reducing or increasing their working time because it is temporary. Am I going to reduce my working time because I know that the experiment will last for 3 years and I should enjoy it? Or should I keep my job because actually it's gonna be only there for 3 years, so I might as well not take the risk of changing jobs? So it's always biased. And in a provocative way, I also like to say, did we do pilot projects or experiments when we launched social security systems after the Second World War? Or more provocatively, did we make experiments when we implemented austerity? No. So I think at some point we need, of course, we need to fine tune our proposals, but we need to try, and we have a lot of data already, or at least avenues for what we should aim for in terms of implementing such a policy. We should take a jump in, and I was going to say in the unknown, but it is not in the unknown, a jump into a transformational perspective.
If I may, just a very concrete example, because I see we have some Brazilians assisting to the debate. Actually, an interesting But it's even more than an experiment, although it's not very famous amongst UBI researchers. I don't know why. Myself, I only discovered it some 1 year ago or so. Is an experiment, well, actually a basic income, sort of, not yet full basic income, but I have 2 links I just shared now in the forum that you can read, and it's very well explained. It's in a municipality in Brazil, where basic income, sort of, I repeat, is in place, not in cash, but as a sort of voucher to be used in accepted places within the city only. So this is extremely interesting, at least for me, not only because it shows our basic income is very well prepared and suited to answer a pandemic situation or another crisis situation. This is very well explained in one of the links I sent, because there the amount of this income was more than doubled during the period of the confinement. So you see that even in a country, because it was one of the questions, where a federal government extremely reluctant to give social support, cities, and I'm a convinced municipalist, so I really believe in the power of cities. Cities can have a word. It is very difficult in terms of fiscal policies, of course. François said it regarding European level and national level. So imagine between national level and city level, it's much more complex and difficult, but still there's a possibility. And the second aspect of interest for me is that, and I know this is very sensitive amongst even the definition of basic income. I think that the basic income in the form of a parallel currency, let me not use the word voucher because it's yet a different thing, but in the form of a parallel currency to be used within a city or a region, can indeed have yet an extra transformative power to promote social and economic and ecological transition.
Great, thank you. I was just going to say on the Alaska example, I just read an interesting article about the political repercussions of it. And it was talking about how, I think it was in the last gubernatorial elections where a Republican governor was elected, one of his campaign promises was to significantly increase the amount of the cash paid out, and he won on the strength of that, and then ended up not being able to fulfill the promise. But I think what's interesting also about UBI is that by virtue of it being universal, once it's instituted, it does make it politically more sustainable because everybody is invested in it, and sustainable not only in terms of maintaining the program per se, but also maintaining an amount that's significant, where, you know, in conditional cash transfers and other targeted programs to the poor, who by virtue of not, you know, having less political voice, there's always a danger of it being, if not cut off totally, then just, you know, less and less in terms of amount and impact. So there's another question. The pandemic exacerbates social inequality, income concentration, and other kinds of social injustice across the world, where worldwide social scientists and other scientists were to prevent the impact of another threat to the most vulnerable groups. We know that it was not possible to prevent the pandemic, but it was our responsibility, our role as researchers, to offer effective and short responses to the poor people. Now, what is the role of our research? It's kind of a big and complicated question, but maybe somebody can take up this part about what is the role of people like yourselves, academics, researchers, in the social scientists, to better prepare, I guess, for the impact of a next pandemic or another catastrophe similar to this one. François?
I'm not as presumptuous as saying what the role of all researchers are, but I would like to give you my own perspective on that. I myself believe a lot in interdisciplinarity, and I think so. In my research, I try to have a philosophical approach and then an economic and legal/political approach to go from what is the most abstract to the most concrete ways of seeing a policy. And I think it is important to have all these different levels working all together, because we need philosophers and people who make proposals about new policies to enlarge the scope of the possibilities, and then we need to have people who are on the ground to reflect on them, to improve the details about or do what we call the fine-tuning of the policies. And I am quite certain that researchers have had and are currently having an enormous impact on what we can put forward. And only in Belgium, I have seen many researchers gathering to publish different kinds of manifestos or proposals for what is the day after the pandemic. And we clearly need researchers with social workers, for example, to work all together to propose coherent, systemic views of what the world can be. And I'm sure we will have, and you will have other webinars also on that, but clearly we need to address the social and ecological dimensions altogether. And when researchers are sometimes confined in their own discipline or in their own social or ecological approach, well, we need to make them work all together, and politicians need to listen to them a bit more.
Well, I think it's 10:15 now, so we might want to, I think, start wrapping up. Thank you so much to the panelists. For me, it was a really interesting discussion, and maybe, two really big points coming out of it is that on the one hand, it's not, UBI is not the cure-all, it's not the panacea for all social ills. It has to be combined with other policy instruments. But at the same time, it is something that can provoke a real big transformational change in terms of how we look at the economy and society. And in that sense, now in this pandemic that's upended everything, it's a really good time to think about it. And perhaps in a future discussion, we can look at how this idea can be applied to the developing world, where really, resources and where to get them is a constraining issue. But thank you so much. I really learned a lot. But before we close, Dominicos has some messages, so I'll pass it on to you.
Well, thank you everybody for the provocative engagement of the today's session. Of course, that brings us to the end. I just wanted to note that this integrated approach that you all advocated for, that combines all elements on economy, governance, and the reforms that they have to undergo to become even better for us and for the planet, is also a message that Fox clearly is trying to pass, which is, and our motto is to explain, challenge, and bind the world. Please, by closing the session, I would like to say to our attendees to follow us on our social media. Please go check and sign the petition if you like the Engagement for Better petition on change.org. We will just include here the necessary links. Follow us on social media, engage with us, and just to say that the Engagement for Better petition is just a way, as we all discussed here, the various ways how to get there where we want, for a more fair and inclusive world and sustainable world. And we are happy to engage with you if you have any question or even ideas on how to make this even bigger and even better. Thank you all, and see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you.